They say every family has secrets, but some secrets are too dark to speak aloud. Deep in the heart of rural America, hidden from the eyes of neighbors, strangers, and even history itself, there existed a family whose story would make most recoil in disbelief. Generations bound not just by blood, but by an obsession with preserving that blood, twisting love into something unrecognizable. Theirs was a world where the ordinary laws of kinship dissolved, where the definitions of family, morality, and humanity blurred into shadows. In the quiet towns nearby, people whispered about strange behaviors, about children who seemed different, about marriages that raised unspoken questions. But no one could have imagined the full depth of the horrors waiting to be uncovered. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This family's history begins like many others, with settlers carving a life from the wilderness, struggling to survive. But as the years wore on, their desire to keep their lineage pure evolved into something sinister. Brother married sister, cousin married cousin. Each generation added another layer of genetic complexity, each union sowing the seeds of degeneration. And yet, despite the obvious signs, the family remained fiercely protective of their secrets. Outsiders were met with smiles and polite nods, a facade of normality masking something far more unsettling. What drew them to this path? Some historians point to isolation, the remoteness of their homesteads, and a rigid worldview that equated bloodline with power. Others suggest something darker, a psychological compulsion passed like an invisible inheritance. Children were taught to obey, to respect, and above all, to maintain the family line. The world outside became irrelevant, almost forbidden. Every action was measured against one terrifying question: would it strengthen the bloodline or weaken it? The physical effects of generations of inbreeding were subtle at first, slight differences in appearance, odd behavioral quirks. But over time, the consequences became undeniable. Health problems, mental instability, and an eerie uniformity in features began to mark the family members, a living mirror of their own isolation and obsession. To those who knew them, it was a kind of curse, though one they rarely spoke of. And yet, for the family, each birth was celebrated, each new child a continuation of a mission that had begun long before their time. As the story unfolds, the full weight of their choices becomes impossible to ignore. This was not merely a family with odd traditions or poor judgment. It was a lineage that had willingly surrendered to darkness in the pursuit of an ideal only they understood. And buried in their hidden histories are secrets so shocking, so disturbing, that they challenge the very notion of what it means to be human. Generations passed, and the family's obsession only deepened. What began as cautious, deliberate unions between distant relatives slowly mutated into something far more extreme. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, cousins intertwined in endless loops of blood. Each act was justified in the name of survival, of preserving a legacy that had long since lost touch with morality. Outsiders couldn't understand, and those who tried to intervene were politely pushed away, or simply ignored. Within the family, obedience was absolute. Questioning the rules was unthinkable. The very idea of stepping outside the invisible walls of the homestead was a betrayal. The consequences were not only biological but psychological. Children were raised in an atmosphere thick with secrecy, where affection and fear were inseparable. They learned early that family was both sanctuary and prison, that love was a weapon and loyalty a cage. Conversations that would be normal elsewhere, about marriage, ambition, or the future, were carefully curated, twisted to ensure the family line remained untouched by outsiders. Any deviation risked punishment, shame, or ostracization, yet the children grew into adults who willingly perpetuated the same cycles. The pattern had become self-sustaining, a dark machine of tradition and compulsion that fed on itself. Visitors to the region often sensed something wrong, though they couldn't put their finger on it. Children who seemed older than their years in some ways, yet delayed in others. A family that never grew tired of one another's company, as if the wider world held no interest. And beneath their polite smiles lurked whispers, strange stories that drifted through the local towns like a cold wind. People avoided asking questions. Rumors of deformities, premature deaths, and violent outbursts circulated quietly, never fully verified, always dismissed as superstition. Yet the truth was far stranger and far darker. than anything the imagination could conjure. The family kept meticulous records, almost obsessively so, of births, marriages, and deaths. Genealogical charts traced lines that, to the casual observer, seemed ordinary. But for those who studied them closely, the patterns were alarming. Bloodlines that should have diverged had instead looped back upon themselves, creating a tangle of genetic repetition. Each marriage was a calculated decision, each child a potential carrier of both inheritance and curse. And the deeper you looked, the clearer it became that this was no accident. It was a deliberate design, executed over decades across generations, with a precision that was almost clinical in its cruelty. Yet the darkest secrets were not the genetic consequences alone, but the human toll. Marriages between siblings or close relatives brought shame, guilt, and confusion. Children struggled with identity, with desire, with the haunting knowledge that their own flesh and blood had been chosen for them as partners. The family's philosophy, built on loyalty and preservation, demanded sacrifices that no outsider could truly comprehend. And while the world outside carried on unaware inside the walls of their homes, a quiet horror played out every day, in plain sight but unseen. As time marched on, the family's isolation became almost absolute. Neighbors stopped visiting, townspeople whispered and then withdrew, and the surrounding landscape seemed to absorb the secrets, as if nature itself were complicit. Children grew up seeing only the world their parents built, a microcosm of control and repetition, where the sun never fully illuminated the truth. They were taught to revere the family name above all else, to internalize a doctrine that equated love with obligation and obedience with survival. Any thoughts of escape, of seeking connection beyond the homestead, were subtly, and sometimes violently, discouraged. And then there were the rituals. Ordinary life was punctuated by ceremonies, celebrations that on the surface appeared wholesome: weddings, baptisms, family reunions. But beneath these familiar markers of Americana lay undertones of compulsion and coercion. Each marriage, each union, was less about choice and more about calculation. The family documented each event with obsessive care, recording births and bloodlines with a precision that suggested not pride but a silent, almost religious devotion to the perpetuation of their own lineage. In the eyes of the family, the outside world was dangerous, corrupt, unworthy. Their own home was the sanctuary and the prison. This relentless focus on blood created consequences both tragic and grotesque. Some children were born with severe physical and cognitive disabilities, while others exhibited strange, erratic behaviors that defied explanation. The family endured these outcomes, stoically interpreting them as trials or warnings rather than signs of error. Over time, these inherited afflictions became part of the family identity, a mark of their commitment to what they saw as a sacred duty. Yet, for an outsider, the sight of multiple generations struggling with the same afflictions, all stemming from the same interwoven bloodlines, was nothing short of horrifying. There was a haunting consistency to it all. Faces, features, mannerisms seemed to echo across decades like shadows replaying a script no one dared rewrite. And in these faces, in these repeated gestures, lay the truth of what obsession can create: beauty twisted into uniformity, love entangled with compulsion, innocence co-opted by history. It was as if the family had become both authors and victims of a story they could neither escape nor fully understand. Each generation was a chapter, each child a sentence in a tale that seemed designed to shock, terrify, and challenge the very notions of morality and kinship. By the mid-20th century, the family's notoriety began to creep beyond the valley and hollows where they lived. A few outsiders caught glimpses, some attempted to document the lineage, but even the bravest investigators often found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what they uncovered. They described a sense of suffocation, of staring into a mirror that reflected not just faces, but the accumulated shadows of generations. And for those who persisted, who probed too deeply, the results were unsettling evidence of manipulation, coercion, and a deliberate commitment to a tradition most societies had long abandoned. By the time the late 20th century arrived, the consequences of decades of inbreeding were impossible to ignore. The family had become almost grotesque in its uniformity, faces, features, and even mannerisms repeating like a dark echo through time. Some members suffered from severe physical deformities, others displayed unsettling behavioral patterns, aggression, obsession, and an inability to distinguish right from wrong. And yet, inside the family, these traits were often rationalized, explained away as quirks or as evidence of the family's unique destiny. To outsiders, it was alarming. To the family, it was normal. What is perhaps most chilling is the psychological weight carried by those trapped within the cycle. Children were taught from the moment they could understand language that their duty was bloodline, that desire and affection were subordinate to legacy. Curiosity about the outside world was met with suspicion. Questions about morality, about love, about right and wrong were answered with lessons in obedience and the sanctity of their own heritage. Any attempt to resist was subtly punished, sometimes overtly, and over time compliance became instinctual. For those inside, life was a narrow corridor, each step dictated by generations that had come before, each breath a repetition of choices made long before they were born. And yet, despite the horror, there were moments of human vulnerability, fleeting glimpses of what might have been. A child's laughter, a whispered confession between siblings, a fleeting moment of doubt in a mother's eyes, all hints of an inner life struggling against the suffocating structure imposed upon them. These moments, however brief, are haunting precisely because they remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit resists, however quietly. But for this family, the resistance was rarely enough. The machinery of tradition, obsession, and secrecy was relentless, and it consumed all who fell under its shadow. By the time authorities or historians began to take note, the family had already become something almost mythic in its secrecy. The few outsiders who documented their lineage described it in clinical terms: the repetition of traits, the statistical improbabilities, the observable effects of centuries of deliberate inbreeding. But clinical descriptions cannot convey the psychological and emotional weight of what it was like to live inside such a lineage. The tension, the fear, the sense of inevitability that hung over every life, every choice. And even today, those who grew up in that environment carry memories too painful, too unnatural to speak aloud. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Consider for a moment the lives that unfolded here, each one dictated by a decision made generations before, each one a living testament to what can happen when human curiosity, desire, and morality are subsumed entirely by obsession. It is a chilling lesson, a dark mirror of what lurks beneath the surface of family, history, and the human soul. Even as the world outside evolved, the family remained trapped in a time of their own making. While modern society progressed, electricity, highways, television, their lives were dictated by ancient rules, by a devotion to a bloodline that had become both religion and prison. Children grew into adults, repeating the cycles of their forebears, marrying within the family, producing children, and continuing the line with an almost ritualistic precision. To anyone looking in, it seemed unnatural, almost impossible, but to them it was ordinary, the very definition of normal. Medical experts who later studied the lineage were struck by the consequences: genetic disorders, congenital deformities, mental instability, all concentrated in one family, amplified by decades of repeated inbreeding. Yet, despite these overwhelming indicators, the family showed a steadfast, almost fanatical, commitment to their path. For them, preserving the bloodline was more important than health, happiness, or even survival. Every birth was celebrated, every child viewed as both gift and responsibility, a living embodiment of a generational obsession that had long since eclipsed conventional morality. There is an unsettling beauty to the way history preserves such stories. Unlike myths or legends, these events were real, carried out in homes not unlike your own, in towns not unlike any you might pass through. The juxtaposition is terrifying: ordinary landscapes concealing horrors that defy comprehension. Neighbors may have suspected something, but suspicion without evidence yields only rumors. And within the family, those who questioned even in private learned quickly that silence was not just preferred, it was survival. The deeper one delves into their records, the more layers of secrecy are revealed. Diaries, letters, genealogical charts, each a testament to lives lived under the weight of compulsion. Every union, every child, every sorrow and triumph meticulously documented, almost as if to justify the choices made across generations. It is a record not only of lineage, but of human obsession, of the ways in which devotion, fear, and pride can merge into a force that shapes lives in ways most would consider unimaginable. And still, the family endured. Through hardships, social isolation, and the relentless progression of consequences, They persisted, stubbornly maintaining a legacy few could understand, and even fewer could imagine confronting. Their story serves as both warning and fascination, a glimpse into a world where human desire and human obsession intersect in the most disturbing ways, and where the line between love, duty, and horror is blurred beyond recognition. By the dawn of the 21st century, the family story had become almost impossible to untangle from myth. Few outsiders had ventured close enough to document it fully, and those who did often left haunted by what they saw. The physical and psychological toll of generations of inbreeding was undeniable. Faces repeated like shadows, bodies carrying the weight of centuries, minds shaped by a rigid, suffocating doctrine. And yet, the family persisted, surviving in a world that had largely forgotten them, a hidden chapter of American history written in secrecy and silence. The community around them had learned to avert its gaze. Locals whispered of strange gatherings, of children behaving oddly, of adults who seemed almost frozen in time, yet these stories were always dismissed as folklore. For those who dared investigate, the reality proved far darker than rumors suggested. Here were not just peculiar customs or isolated tragedies, but a living lineage molded by obsession, fear, and a devotion to blood that defied morality. Each revelation challenged everything we think we know about family, about heredity, about what it means to survive at the cost of humanity. The family's legacy is a cautionary tale written not in law or literature, but in flesh and memory. It reminds us that history is not only made by the powerful or the famous, but by those hidden in shadows, whose choices echo across generations in ways both tragic and terrifying. To peer into their world is to confront the uncomfortable truth that human beings, when driven by obsession and fear, can create realities far removed from our understanding of right and wrong. It is a story that lingers, haunting the imagination, refusing to be forgotten, because it touches something primal: our fascination with blood, inheritance, and the limits of human endurance. And yet amid the horror, there is something undeniably human, fleeting moments of tenderness, of humor, of love twisted into strange forms, reminders that even in the darkest circumstances, life persists, and the human spirit, however warped, continues to struggle, to breathe, to exist. Theirs is a story of survival, of obsession, of choices that no one should have to make. And it is ours now too, because in knowing it, we become witnesses to a past that was deliberately hidden, a history too dark for daylight, yet too compelling to ignore. The story of the Most Inbred Family in America is not simply one of biological consequence. It is a chronicle of secrecy, of psychological entanglement, of the devastating ways in which devotion to blood can overshadow every other measure of life. It serves as a mirror to the human condition, reflecting our capacity for both love and horror, for preservation and destruction, for the ordinary and the unspeakable. And in that reflection we see not only them, but ourselves, confronted with questions we may never fully answer. There are places in America where history is buried not in textbooks or museums, but in the quiet corners of forgotten homes, in the lives of families whose stories are too dark to tell aloud. This family, more than any other, embodies that hidden history, a lineage shaped by obsession, sustained by secrecy, and haunted by the consequences of choices that span centuries. What began as a desire to preserve a name became an unrelenting cycle of inbreeding, manipulation, and silent suffering, leaving scars that no law, no neighbor, no outsider could erase. Visiting their story today, one is struck not only by the genetic legacy but by the psychological one. Each generation inherited more than just physical traits. They inherited fear, compliance, and the invisible chains of expectation. Children learned early that questioning was dangerous, that survival demanded conformity, that love was measured in loyalty to a bloodline rather than to one another. Adults, in turn, perpetuated these lessons, often without conscious malice, trapped in the very framework that had been imposed on them. In this way, the family became both victim and perpetrator, a living testament to how isolation and obsession can warp humanity over time. The records they left behind are chilling. Diaries speak of pride and dread in equal measure. Genealogical charts reveal patterns that stagger the imagination. Letters between relatives hint at tenderness, but also at secrecy and compulsion. And woven through all of it is the shadow of inevitability, the sense that nothing, no law, no morality, no outside influence, could alter the trajectory of this family. They were bound to themselves, to their history, to a cycle that had begun long before anyone watching could intervene. Yet there is a haunting universality to their tale. It is a story of human nature pushed to its extremes, of the consequences when devotion to lineage eclipses everything else. It is a story that asks uncomfortable questions. What lengths would one go to preserve family? How much suffering is justified in the name of loyalty? And when does love become something unrecognizable, something dark and consuming? These are not questions with easy answers, and they are precisely what make this family's history unforgettable. A case study in obsession, isolation, and the shadows that lurk beneath the veneer of normal life. In the end, the story of the most inbred family in America is both a warning and an invitation. It warns of the dangers of unchecked tradition and obsession, of the invisible costs that accumulate when human life is subordinated to ideology. And it invites us to confront history in its rawest, most uncomfortable form, to peer into shadows we would rather ignore, to recognize the fragility of morality when constrained by fear and secrecy, and to remember that even the darkest stories are part of the human experience. Their legacy is not one of heroes or villains, but of truth, an unsettling, haunting truth that refuses to be forgotten.